All right, in this lecture, we're going to continue on with our discussion of, again, some of the characteristics of wealth inequality and capitalism. Um, and basically, the first thing we can talk about is a change or a shift, you could say, in kind of values or perspective, which we sometimes call stakeholder versus shareholder capitalism. Okay? And the difference between those two things, they look very similar. Again, post World War II, again, the economy of the United States was booming. It was the last major economic superpower left in the world after World War II. And the American economy saw a huge boom. We also saw a very large overall raise in just general wealth in the United States. We could say that basically American families became richer, and we sometimes talk about the idea became richer together. This concept of everybody working together, pulling together, and again, average household earnings from about the late 1940s into the early 70s steadily increased, right? And we sometimes refer to this as the American dream, the golden age of the American family. There's lots of different terms. Again, some of these family-related terms we'll talk about a little bit later in the semester. But for the most part, it was always assumed that within families, that as well as parents were doing, children would always be better off, right? That was one of those things we incorporated into that concept of the American dream. Doing better than your parents did, right? Achieving more education, being able to get a better job. So we saw factory workers, send children to college, and then they became professionals, and then they had a bigger house than their parents had. And we always imagined kind of this idea. Now, again, lots of other variations come in here. I'm ignoring purposely, or not ignoring, but at least turning aside, some components of race into this whole thing. But for the most part, the kind of concept within the United States was, everybody pulled together to work for a better future. And this was held kind of as a social contract among businesses, right? That businesses looked at employees as what we call stakeholders. Right? When you're a stakeholder in something, you've got the best interest of the company involved. The company has your best interest involved, right? We, our company, are going to work with our employees to try to kind of achieve this social contract of what's in the worker's best interest is best for the company, right? And that was that stakeholder philosophy. And you saw many people do this for a very long time. If your grandparents or your great grandparents are alive today, sometimes workers worked at one job for their entire lives, and they made a decent living doing so. With the idea that the company's looking out for me, I'm looking out for the company. As we move to much more of a corporation, less private ownership of corporations or big businesses, and certainly much more investment by the wealthy into this, through things like the stock market, right? We see a shift from stakeholders to the interest of shareholders. Shareholders are those people who have invested in a publicly traded company. In other words, stockholders, those people who own a piece of a large corporation. And the idea basically is, why do people do that? They're looking for a return on their investment. So again, if you're buying shares of GE, Disney, Global Oil, whatever else it is, you want to buy a stock at $20, and you want to see that stock continue to increase, so that when you sell it, you will get more back from what it's worth. So you buy a share in a company of $20, and 2 years later that stock is worth $200. You've made an incredible investment on that shareholding that you've done. Well, of course, when we talk about shareholders and their influence on the corporations, is of course purely to get their money back, right? So if a corporation is beholden to its shareholders, who are they not going to be beholden to? Probably their stakeholders, right? A lot of ways that companies cut expenses to make more profit, to better the income of shareholders, is by doing things like reducing employee benefits, cutting down the size of workforces, cutting back on safety measures for workers, those kind of things. So when we see this shift from stakeholder to shareholder capitalism, we've definitely seen a shift in the United States from let's do what's good for everybody in the company to let's do what's good for our shareholders. A lot of this also came about when, again, shareholders say, okay, if things are being too expensive, and this is, we often hear the common complaint, nothing's being made in the United States anymore. Nothing, we're not producing things. We're shipping jobs, quote unquote, overseas, right? We're sending all our factory and production overseas. That's largely because corporations are trying to make as much money as they possibly can, and it is cheaper. When we talk about this effective globalization, to manufacture things in other countries where wages are lower and safety expectations and standards are lower, right? And then shareholders make more money from that, but of course at the expense of American workers. So we definitely know, again, the Wall Street Journal in 1994 was famous for a very prophetic and in some ways apocalyptic kind of message. The social contract between employers and employees is dead, 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 according to the Wall Street Journal. Again, in the 1990s and into the 2000s, politicians and corporate heads were raving about there being a booming economy in the United States. However, workers were working longer hours for less money in the United States. And this is largely because of this shift, right, from stakeholder to shareholder. And we definitely know that in the United States today, even in the case of things like labor unions, that the balance of power has shifted much more to employers than to employees or laborers in our society. And again, this is, you can read about this in the text, that this form of American capitalism has shifted to many other places around the world. Okay? Another way that we see changes in capitalism affect this kind of idea of wealth inequality is in the measure of what we call public squalor. Okay, and this idea of squalor, if you've ever heard that word before, it's not a particularly word with good connotations to it. Usually, on an individual level, people talk about living in squalor, living in unhealthy, dirty conditions. Right? When we talk about the United States and we measure this thing called public squalor, what we're talking about are the conditions of basically our infrastructure. Right? America is widely regarded as the largest economy and the wealthiest nation in the world, and yet we have, and again, direct quote, our infrastructure is in abysmal condition. We've seen this play out numerous times. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf of Mexico, but most specifically the city of New Orleans, which again, a city built on a gulf, a large body of water, which is subject to hurricanes. This wasn't the first hurricane that New Orleans ever experienced. They had a system of levees and dams that were supposed to mitigate this, which failed completely. And obviously the city of New Orleans was nearly annihilated. Again, we see dam collapses all over the United States, bridge collapses. Just recently in Pennsylvania, we saw a large bridge collapse out near Pittsburgh. If we look at, and there is again, I've introduced what we call an infrastructure report card in the module that you can look up, and you can see that basically approximately 1/3 of the major roads in the United States are considered to be either poor or mediocre condition. About 28%, again, almost 1/3 of the bridges in our society are considered obsolete, meaning no longer structurally sound. We have approximately 250,000 water main breaks in cities and towns all over the US, so the drinking water that's pumped to our towns. And then many of the pipe and sewer systems are over 100 years old. Lancaster, the city I'm standing in right now, still has a large portion of its water delivery services are through 100-year-old ceramic pipes. Uh, in 2013, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave the U.S.'s infrastructure a D plus, and at the time estimated that the necessary cost for repairs to America's infrastructure would be $3.6 trillion. TRILLION. And that hasn't gotten any better. In some ways, again, you'll see on the website that's constantly being upgraded, those infrastructure report cards. In some ways, the United States has made some slight improvements. There have definitely been some attempts to update our infrastructure, especially when it influences us on a personal level, like bridges and highways collapsing. But we definitely know that there's many other countries around the world which have very similar infrastructures to ours, but do a much better job of doing the upkeep to those things. Again, usually through higher tax rates. And again, this concept, we're back to that social construction, that higher taxes equals socialism. But what we're clearly seeing in our society now is the effects of allowing our infrastructure to crumble.